Okay, this is part 4, and just a quick word of warning before we start. Camera lenses can be addictive. Okay, there's lots of different ways to categorize lenses, but I think the most important one is zoom lenses versus what we call prime lenses. Zoom lenses generally are more convenient because they zoom, but in very general terms the image quality is not as good from a zoom lens as you'll get from a prime lens. Prime lenses don't zoom at all, so you have to zoom with your feet, but the advantages they have is, firstly, image quality tends to be better than you get from a zoom lens, and secondly, they tend to let in a lot more light than zoom lenses do, so that makes your life a lot easier in low light conditions. The other advantage of prime lenses over zoom lenses is the prime lenses tend to be cheaper, so that's a good thing obviously if you're just starting out with your photography and you don't want to throw thousands of pounds at camera equipment. Now, as I touched on in part 1 of this series, camera lenses are every bit as important, if not more important, than the camera bodies, and you get better results with a good quality lens on an entry-level camera than you would get with a low quality lens on a top of the range camera. So I would always choose a good lens over a good camera. So in this video I just want to give you a bit of general advice about lenses. I don't want to get too deeply into the specs on any particular lenses, particularly given that you might be shooting with Nikon or Sony or Olympus or Fuji. So in this video I'm just going to give you an outline of some of the types of lenses that you might choose to go out and buy, and to try and help you to avoid making some of the mistakes that I made when I was choosing some of my lenses in the early days. Now in part 2 I pointed you towards getting an inexpensive 50mm f1.8 lens, and that's a nice starting lens. It's a more sensible choice than going for a jack-of-all-trades lens like this one here, which was another lens that I bought in the early days. This Sigma lens goes from 18mm to 200mm. And if you divide the 200 by the 18, you get 11, so it's an 11 times zoom. But the images from this are of similar quality to the kit lens that often comes with entry-level cameras. And so this wasn't a step up in image quality at all, it was just a step up in convenience. I was able to get much nicer looking shots from the much cheaper 50mm, which goes for about $100. The next lens that I would strongly recommend is this Canon 85mm f1.8, or the equivalent lens for the brand of camera that you're using. It's a very strong performer. 85mm lenses are, as I understand it, the easiest to construct. They are the simplest in their construction, and therefore it's very easy to manufacture a very high quality 85mm lens for a modest amount of money. This one goes for, I think, about £250 in the UK at the moment, and I'd say it's pretty much a match for any of my lenses, and as I say, it's quite a modest price. The only real downside of this lens is on an entry-level camera it's quite a long, quite a zoomed in image. I mean, it's not a lens that you would use indoors unless you're in a large hall or perhaps in a church at a wedding ceremony. It's fine for that sort of thing, and it's a great outdoor lens. As with a 50mm lens, this 85mm can be used on professional full frame camera bodies, whereas some of these other lenses like this Sigma that I mentioned, that will only work on an entry-level camera. So whichever manufacturer your camera is made by, there's probably going to be a nice inexpensive 85mm and 50mm lens that you can pick up for sensible money, and I would certainly recommend those. 85mm is also a nice focal length for portraits of individual people. It's not so great for group shots unless you've got lots of space to work with. You might also want to consider something a bit wider, particularly if you're shooting on an entry-level crop sensor, because they make everything more zoomed in. You might want to consider a 30mm or a 35mm. These two are Sigma lenses. I think this one goes for about £300. It's a 30mm f1.4, but it'll only work on entry-level cameras. This is the 35mm f1.4. This is the latest generation of Sigma lenses. This will work on a full-frame professional camera or an entry-level camera. Sigmas, particularly the new ones, this new range, this is an art series lens. The image quality is very nice. The focus, I tend to find, is a bit less reliable than the Canon or Nikon equivalents. But when these lenses focus properly, they have very nice image quality. Often it's actually better than the more expensive Canon equivalent lenses. So it's worth considering what we call third-party lenses. Just bear in mind that they're not quite as consistent with the focusing as the Canon counterparts. As I mentioned, both of these are f1.4 lenses, and the lower the f number that the lens is labelled with, the more light the lens will let in, and therefore the better job they'll do in low light conditions. Now, unless you're spending a four-figure sum on your lens, it's probably not going to go lower than f1.4. That's quite a good lens in terms of light gathering ability. But f1.4 lenses are not cheap. This 35mm, which is only for use on entry-level cameras, I think these go for about £300 at the moment. And this newer generation 30mm, I think these go for about £550 at the moment. So they're not cheap, but they do make your life a lot easier in low light. Just as a side note, just so you can understand the importance of the f number, an f1.4 lens lets in twice as much light as an f2 lens, and an f2 lens lets in twice as much light as an f2.8 lens. Now, the mathematicians amongst you might have noticed that you multiply the number by 1.4. So if we take this f1.4, multiply that by 1.4, we get approximately 2. If we multiply 2 by 1.4, we get f2.8. So when you're looking at lenses, you're looking at the f numbers. That gives you a rough idea of how different lenses compare. So if I want to let twice as much light in as this f1.4, I would have to go to an f1 lens, and they're pretty rare and pretty expensive. The remaining two prime lenses here are not necessarily lenses that I recommend to beginners. This one is a macro lens, so it's specifically for very close-up photography, which is something you might want to explore once you get further down the line with your photography. Macro shots can be really quite impressive. And this is what we call a pancake lens, which is really just it's a quirky little thing that takes some quite nice shots. It's an aperture of f2.8, 40mm lens. It's just a nice, light, convenient lens. In Turning to zoom lenses. Now, zoom lenses are much more difficult to construct, and that's reflected in their price. There's a multitude of inexpensive zooms like the Sigma 18-200 that I mentioned, but I would suggest that you try and avoid those. If you want half decent image quality from a zoom lens, you do need to spend a fair bit of money. The lens that I'm filming this with is a Canon 24-105 f4 lens. It looks, to the untrained eye, the same as this 24-70 f2.8 lens. The f4 lens is about a third of the price of this one. I think it goes for about £500 in the UK, which I know is a huge amount of money if you're just starting out, but it's a zoom lens that is definitely worth looking at. The image quality is pretty nice and it's quite versatile, going from 24 to 105 millimeters, and it does have image stabilization, so it's also a very good video lens. The only real downside is that it's an f4 lens, so it doesn't let in a huge amount of light. The image stabilization though does help to compensate for that to a certain degree, and it's a lens that I would certainly consider as a beginner if you've got the funds to buy one. And if you're shooting with Canon, another lens it's worth considering if you're looking for a general purpose zoom lens is the f4 version of this 24-70, which also gets very well reviewed. Additionally, there are some ultra-wide angled lenses. Again, we're in sort of fairly specialist territory here, so if you're just starting out, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you go for an ultra-wide zoom. And then finally, these are actually the two lenses that I use the most. If I'm shooting a wedding, I'll shoot probably 80-90% of the shots with these two zoom lenses. Between them, they take me from 24mm to 200mm, which is pretty much all the range I need. They are f2.8 lenses, which is not a fantastic aperture in low light, but in good light, these are pretty much all I need. These two give me prime lens standard image quality, and they give me the convenience of a zoom. The only thing that they don't give me that prime lenses do is those very low f numbers, f1.4, f1.8. So for the evening shots at a wedding, I would typically revert to my prime lenses, and my most commonly used lenses on an evening would be my 35mm f1.4 and my 85mm f1.8. So just to recap then, if I was starting over again in photography, the lenses that I would purchase and the order that I would purchase them in, I would get myself an inexpensive 50mm lens, a nice quality 85mm prime. If I was shooting Canon, I would go for the 24-105 as represented by this. And money permitting, I would get myself a nice f1.4 lens, probably a 35mm like this one. And between those lenses, that would do everything that I would need and more as a beginner photographer. If you can only afford to buy one decent lens and you need a general purpose lens that's going to do most of what you need, then I would certainly consider the 24-105 f4 or the equivalent lens for your brand of camera. So just to summarise, if image quality is your priority and you want your photos to have the wow factor, prime lenses are going to be the way to go. You can shoot in low light, you can get those nice blurry backgrounds, the shallow depth of field that you get with the low f number lenses. They are relatively inexpensive, but the main downside is that you have to zoom with your feet. You don't have the convenience of a zoom built into the lens. If you think you're going to progress with your photography onto the professional standard cameras, I would avoid the lenses that can only be used on the entry-level cameras. Again, coming back to this Sigma as a good example. So on the Canon side, that means choosing EF lenses rather than EFS lenses. Anyway, I hope there was some information in there that was of use to you. As always, thank you for watching, and if you got something useful out of this, please just take a couple of seconds just to click on the like button. I'd be really grateful if you do that, and if you haven't already done so, please subscribe.